The buffalo calf cost $2 at the Comanche County dispersal sale on a Wednesday morning in May of 1932. And the reason it cost $2 was that nobody at the sale believed it would live through the weekend. Delphine Aldrich was at the rail for fence wire and a used harness, and she had already decided against both by the time she reached the pen at the far end of the lot, the one nobody was standing near. The calf was small and reddish-brown, the color calves of that breed carried before the darker adult coat came in, with a rounded hump already showing at the shoulders and a face too broad for the rest of him, the specific structure that marked him as something other than the cattle penned around him. He was orphaned. The auctioneer said his dam had died calving 3 weeks back on a ranch outside Coldwater that was liquidating its small bison herd along with everything else it owned, and the calf had been hand-fed since, badly, by men who had cattle to worry about and no patience for a bottle-fed buffalo calf that wasn't worth the grain. He was thin in the way that meant weeks of inconsistent feeding, not one bad week. His breathing had a rasp to it. He stood with his legs too far apart, conserving what strength he had left, and watched Delphine come to the rail with dark, alert eyes that hadn't given up on the morning yet. "What is it?" she said, though she knew. "Buffalo," the auctioneer said. "What's left of the Coldwater herd. Rest went to a zoo outfit in Wichita. This one they didn't want. Scours, probably, or something worse. $2 and he's somebody else's problem." Nobody raised a hand. Delphine raised hers. She was 26 years old and had been running her father's 160 acres alone since the fall of 1930, when his heart finally gave out after years of warning signs, and her brother went north to Wichita for shop work that at least paid something. The farm sat at the edge of the mixed grass prairie in southern Kansas, wheat ground gone thin with 2 dry years running, a herd of 11 Herefords that ate more than they earned, and a household account holding $11 before she spent 2 of them on a dying buffalo calf nobody else wanted. She had not planned to buy a buffalo calf. She had planned to buy wire. But she had been reading about the species for 3 months, ever since a notice in the county extension bulletin about the American Bison Society's ongoing survey of private herds. The small remaining population scattered across ranches in Montana, the Dakotas, and a handful of other states, all that remained after the species had been hunted down to fewer than 1,000 animals by the 1880s. The bulletin said the society, along with several state parks and the federal government, had spent 3 decades rebuilding the population through careful private stewardship, that the animals still had almost no commercial value as livestock, that most owners kept them out of civic obligation rather than business sense. She read this with the attention of a woman looking for something the county hadn't already tried and found wanting. She loaded the calf into the truck bed on a bed of straw meant for the harness, and drove home with her hand on his flank most of the way to keep him steady on the turns. ... Before we find out what Delphine does with this dying buffalo calf, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel reaches people from all across the country, and we love knowing where these stories land. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. New stories every week. The county's opinion formed before she'd finished unloading him. Hollis Vance, who ran the feed store and half the county's information alongside it, drove past on the county road not 20 minutes after she'd gotten the calf into the barn, and by Friday, 3 separate people had already asked about the buffalo with the specific concern people reserved for a woman they believed was making a mistake, but didn't want to seem unkind about it. She did not correct them. She went home and built a warming stall from lumber left over from a hog shed her father had never finished, lined it with what clean straw she had, and mixed an electrolyte solution from salt, sugar, and baking soda in the proportions her father's veterinary manual described for scouring calves. Since a buffalo calf's gut worked close enough to a domestic calf's that the same principles applied, according to the one letter she'd already sent to the extension office in Manhattan, asking exactly that question. She dosed him with a rubber-tipped bottle every 3 hours through the first 2 nights, sleeping in the barn on a horse blanket beside his stall so she wouldn't miss a feeding, checking his temperature and his breathing, and writing both numbers in the notebook she kept for the farm's records, a habit she'd inherited from her father, along with the land. By the 3rd day, the rasp in his breathing had eased. By the 5th day, he was taking the bottle without her having to force it. By the 8th day, He stood at the stall gate and watched her cross the barn with the specific, unhurried attention of an animal that had decided, on terms she didn't fully understand and didn't need to, that he intended to keep going. She named him Ezra for no reason she could explain to anyone who asked, which several people did, expecting a story and receiving only the name. Nash Calder was at the east fence the following Tuesday, checking a stretch of wire that ran along the shared line between his 80 acres and hers, wire that had needed checking exactly as often as it had for the better part of 2 years, which was to say not particularly often, though he came anyway. He was tall through the shoulders in the way men got from years of fence work and wheat harvest, sandy-haired, with a way of looking at a problem for a long moment before he said anything about it, which was its own kind of statement. He'd been at that fence with some regularity since the spring after her father died, on the pretext of the line and the drainage cut that ran along it, and Delphine had noticed this the way a person notices weather, present and unremarked upon until it became impossible to ignore. "Heard you bought a buffalo," he said. $2, she said. He looked toward the barn, where nothing was visible from the fence but the roof line. At the Comanche sale, he was dying. Everyone else looked away. "You didn't?" "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was working something out and didn't want to say the wrong half of it out loud. "What are you going to do with a buffalo?" he said finally, not unkindly, the way a man asks a question he genuinely once answered rather than one meant to close a door. "Find out if he's worth keeping alive," she said. "I already know that part. Now I need to find out what for." He nodded slowly, the way he did when he decided a thing wasn't going to be resolved standing at a fence, and went back to the wire that didn't especially need him. Ezra grew the way bison calves grew when they were properly fed and past the worst of what had nearly killed them, which was to say faster than cattle and with a different logic to the growth. By July, his hump had begun the visible rise that would eventually carry the bulk of his forward strength, still small compared to what it would become, but unmistakable to anyone who'd seen a mature bull, which in Comanche County that summer amounted to almost nobody. His coat had begun to darken from the reddish calf color toward the deep brown that would eventually cover him. Patchy at first, coming in unevenly across his shoulders and forequarters through the late summer months, the way the species always molted into its adult coloring. He grazed differently than her Herefords did too, working through the rough pasture grass her cattle left behind, the native bluestem and grama that had gone half wild on the poorer end of her land, in a way that suggested he'd take less doctoring and less hay than any animal she already owned. She wrote to the Extension Office again in August, and this time to the Regional Office of the Federal Bureau of Biological Survey, whose address she'd found printed in the same bulletin that had first mentioned the American Bison Society's private herd survey. She asked plainly what a documented, healthy young bull with no herd of origin currently on record might be worth to anyone conducting that kind of survey, and what, if anything, the government paid for animals contributed to conservation efforts, and whether a single bull without cows to go with him was worth anything to anybody at all. She did not expect a fast answer, and she didn't get one. She kept working with what she had. What she had, through September, was a young bull putting on frame at a rate her father's cattle never had, tolerating the drought-stunted pasture without the weight loss her Herefords were showing, and drawing, increasingly, the specific kind of attention that comes from a thing being visible from a county road that people traveled regularly. Ezra was, by any ordinary measure, the strangest thing standing in a pasture in Comanche County, and the county noticed the way counties always notice things that stood out from the pattern. Hollis Vance told her outright, the third time she came in for supplies, that keeping a buffalo on a working wheat farm was a rich man's hobby dressed up as good sense, and that she'd have done better to put the $2 towards seed. She thanked him for the thought, the way she'd learned to thank people whose opinions she had no plan to revise anything for, and bought her wire and drove home. Verna Ashcroft at the dry goods said something similar to several people that autumn, that the Aldrich girl had gone a little strange since her father passed, that grief did that to people. She said it with the specific concern of a woman who believed she was being kind. It reached Delphine secondhand, the way most things reached her in Comanche County, and she did not go out of her way to correct it, because correcting county gossip took more energy than it was worth. and because she suspected, correctly as it turned out, the numbers would do a better job of it than any conversation could. The extension agent, a careful man named Otis Pruitt, who covered 4 counties on a salary that didn't stretch to match the ground he had to cover, drove out in September after hearing about the buffalo from someone at the co-op. He stood at the fence for a long while, the way men who actually knew livestock tended to, and said that whatever else was true about the animal, he was carrying flesh on rough pasture that would have put weight on nothing else she owned, and that the fact alone was worth writing down. He asked good questions about her feeding regimen, the range cake supplement she'd started once the first frost cut the protein out of the standing grass, and left with a promise to send her whatever bulletins the college in Manhattan had on the subject, which turned out to be very little, since almost nobody in Kansas was doing what she was doing. She kept at the notebook through the fall the way her father had kept his own ledgers, weight estimated by tape measurement since she had no scale built for an animal his size, hump height, chest depth, the specific rate at which his winter coat came in thick and full by November in a way her cattle's coats never quite managed. An adaptation, Pruitt told her, that let the species winter on open range in weather that would finish off a Hereford. She noted the days he broke ice on the stock tank himself rather than waiting for her to do it, dropping his weight through the surface with an ease that told her something about how little the cold actually cost him. Nash was different. He came to the fence more often that fall than the drainage cut required, and he'd taken, without saying so directly, to bringing things that were useful rather than things that were conversation. A sack of range cake in October, when her feed budget was thin and Ezra's growth had begun to outpace what her own hay could support. A morning spent, unasked, mending the section of pasture fence nearest the county road after he'd noticed, correctly, that an animal Ezra's size and disposition needed wire that wouldn't give the way cattle wire sometimes did. "You didn't have to do the fence," she said, when she found him finishing it on a Saturday in October. "I know," he said. "The wire was wrong for what you've got out there now. Wasn't going to sit on that and wait for you to find out the hard way." "That's not the drainage cut." "No," he said, "it isn't." He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't ask for it, because there was a particular kind of conversation that neither of them was ready to have yet, and both of them seemed to understand it the same way. He came back the following Tuesday with a question about the range cake supplier in Coldwater, whether she'd found one who'd deliver in the quantity she'd need once Ezra put on another 200 pounds, and said he was driving that way Thursday regardless and would ask for her. He asked, that same visit, whether she'd thought about a second stock tank for the far pasture, since Ezra had taken to wallowing in the mud around the one she had. Ordinary bison behavior, Pruitt had told her, but one that would ruin the tank's footing by spring if she didn't address it. By the following Saturday, there was a second tank set on a gravel pad Nash had hauled over without being asked, the same way he'd handled the wire, quietly and without requiring the doing of it to be discussed first. She had stopped, sometime around the second frost, expecting an explanation for any of it. He came on Tuesdays for the fence line that no longer strictly needed him, and increasingly on other days for reasons that had stopped pretending to be about the fence line at all, and she had decided, without saying so to him or to anyone, that she preferred it that way. We're halfway through this story, and we want to know, have you ever taken on an animal everyone told you not to bother with? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your reminder. New stories every week. The reply from the Bureau of Biological Survey came in the second week of November, 3 months after her letter, which she had come to understand was simply how government correspondence moved. It was signed by a field officer named Whitcomb, and it was more direct than she'd expected. The survey's regional office, working alongside the remaining efforts of the American Bison Society before its expected dissolution, was interested in documented young bulls of sound conformation and clean, unrelated bloodline, specifically for placement in small state and refuge herds that had lost genetic diversity through decades of close breeding within isolated populations. A healthy 2-year-old bull, properly documented, could be worth considerably more to such a program than any commercial buyer would pay for buffalo meat or hide, since the species carried almost no market value as livestock, but real value as breeding stock for the restoration work the society and the federal government had been quietly funding for years. He asked whether she would allow an officer to inspect the animal in the spring, once Ezra was a full year past weaning and his confirmation could be properly assessed. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then went out to the pasture where Ezra was working through the last of the fall grass with the settled, unhurried movement that had become his particular way of being in the world, and stood at the fence for a long while before she went back inside. Nash was at the east fence 3 days later, and she told him what the letter said. "A government man," he said, "coming to look at your buffalo. In the spring. If Ezra holds the confirmation they're looking for." "You think he will?" "I've been measuring him every 2 weeks since August. Chest depth, hump height, hind quarter width, same measurements the Bureau's own literature says they use for assessment. He's tracking ahead of where the tables say a bull his age should be." She had the notebook with her, the way she nearly always did now, and she showed him the columns of figures, the dates, the steady climb of each measurement against what little published data existed on bison growth rates. He read it the way he read things that mattered to him, slowly, twice through. "You've done the work," he said. "I did the work in August," she said. "I'm only now finding out if it was the right work." He looked out at Ezra grazing in the last low light, the dark hump silhouetted against the pale November grass. An animal that had cost $2 because everyone else at that sale had already decided what he was worth before they'd properly looked. "It was the right work," Nash said. The officer came in April, a lean, sun-worn man who turned out to be Whitcomb himself, and who spent the better part of 2 hours at the pasture fence with a notebook of his own, watching Ezra move, checking the confirmation against standards Delphine had only read about secondhand. He measured what she had already measured and found her figures accurate to within a fraction of an inch on every count, which seemed to settle something in his manner that had been reserved when he arrived. He told her plainly, standing at the fence with his hat pushed back, that Ezra was as sound an animal as he'd assessed in Kansas in 3 years of doing this work, that his bloodline being unrecorded was in this particular case an asset rather than a liability, since the small state herds the survey was working to strengthen needed exactly the kind of outside genetics a documented, unrelated bull could provide, and that he intended to recommend Ezra for placement with a state park herd in the Dakotas that had been breeding too close within itself for 2 generations running. "What would that mean?" Delphine asked, "for what he's worth?" Whitcomb named a figure. It was more than 3 times what she'd cleared from her entire wheat crop the previous year. More money than had changed hands over any single animal in the county in the 2 years she'd been running the farm alone. And it came with a second piece of information she hadn't expected. The survey, understanding that a breeding bull of Ezra's caliber was rare enough to be worth building toward rather than selling off entirely, would also pay a standing fee for the right to breed select cows from other small herds to him on site, an arrangement that let her keep him and still draw income from what he was rather than what he could fetch sold once. "You're saying I don't have to sell him," she said. "I'm saying you'd be foolish to," Whitcomb said. "A bull like that, kept and bred right, is worth more to you over 10 years than any single sale would ever be. That's the arrangement the society's been trying to build with private owners for 30 years now. Keep the good stock, let it work." She thought of the $2 and the 11 left in the household account that spring morning, and the calf too weak to stand properly at the rail, while men who had better things to worry about looked past him. She told Whitcomb she would want the arrangement in writing, every term of it, before she agreed to anything, and he said that was exactly the answer he'd hoped to hear from her. Nash was at the fence when Whitcomb's truck pulled out onto the county road, and she walked over and told him the whole of it, standing in the April evening with the pasture going gold at the edges the way Kansas evenings did when the wheat was finally coming in decent after 2 thin years. "You're not selling him," Nash said. "No, I'm keeping him and getting paid to keep him, which is a different kind of arrangement than I thought I was walking into when I bid $2. Your father would have liked that math," he said. "He would have liked that I didn't ask anybody's permission first," she said. Nash was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet she'd come to recognize as him arriving at something he intended to say. "I've been thinking about the North 40, he said, "the section that runs up against your line." She waited. "It's rough ground, never was much good for wheat, but it's the kind of grass a buffalo herd would do well on if you were building toward a herd instead of just the one bull." He looked at Ezra in the near pasture, the dark shape of him settling in for the evening. I was thinking there might be a way to put that ground to use, if you are of a mind to expand what you've got here. Together is what I mean. Not me telling you what to do with your animal, just the ground, if it'd help. That's a specific kind of offer, she said. I've had 2 years to get specific about it, he said. She looked at him in the lattice of the light, at the fence between his 80 acres and her 160 that had stopped, sometime in the last year, feeling like much of a boundary at all. Come to supper Saturday, she said. Bring whatever papers you've got on the North 40. We'll look at the ground and the numbers both. Saturday, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when something had settled. By the following spring, the arrangement with the survey had brought 2 cows from a herd in Nebraska that had likewise grown too close in its bloodlines, both bred to Ezra under the standing fee Whitcomb had arranged, and a 3rd calf was expected by early summer, this one born on Delphine's own ground rather than purchased at $2 off a rail nobody else wanted to stand near. The household account, which had held $11 the morning she'd driven to the Comanche sale, held considerably more than that now. Between the standing fee, the wheat finally coming in strong on ground that had rested 2 dry years, and Nash's North 40 added into the operation the county had started calling, without much ceremony, the Aldrich Calder place. She stood at the pasture fence one evening in May, with the whole small herd visible in the low light, Ezra and the 2 cows and the promise of a 3rd animal by summer, and thought about the $2 that had started it, the calf too weak to stand properly, and the men at that sale who had already decided, standing at the rail, exactly what the animal was worth before they'd looked closely enough to find out they were wrong. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Leave a comment below. What's the most unlikely thing you've ever seen someone build from almost nothing? Your stories are what makes this community what it is. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll have a new story for you next week. Her father had told her once the unusual thing was either worthless or worth everything, and the only way to find out was to take it seriously enough to look. She had looked on a Wednesday morning with $2 and a dying calf nobody else wanted, and found out which one it was.